In our last session, we talked about the airline industry. And I discussed how this was an industry that was highly competitive, one in which many of the firms, if not most of the firms, have gone in and out of bankruptcy over the years. And when you look at rankings of different industries, it often ranks dead last in terms of average industry profitability. So today, I'd like to talk about an outlier within that industry, Southwest Airlines. Over the last 30+ years, Southwest Airlines has been the most profitable airline in the U.S. airline market. They have found year in, year out success in a market, once again, where most companies are happy with 1 or 2 years of profitability in a row. What explains their success in what is otherwise a brutally competitive market? Now, some point to the unique low-cost strategy that Southwest has. They fly one type of airplane, a 737, and they fly point to point, as opposed to the hub and spoke system adopted by most of the major airline carriers in the U.S. But is that the key? Other low-cost carriers have entered the market and copied the Southwest strategy. So it doesn't seem like that in and of itself makes the difference. So what is unique about Southwest? Well, clearly they have some unique capabilities that's been hard for others to replicate. One is a very fast turnaround time. They talk about their 15-minute turnaround times on flights. Second, despite being a low-cost carrier, they have very high quality ratings when it comes to things like on time, keeping care of your baggage, and the like. So where do these capabilities come from? Well, as we discussed in previous sessions, the fundamental principle of business strategy, if everyone can do it, it's difficult to create and capture value from it. But what could distinguish a Southwest then in this scenario? Last session, we talked about this idea of monopoly rents, this idea that industry structure matters and that industry structure can determine whether an industry is going to be more profitable than another one. In this session, we're going to focus on what are sometimes referred to as Ricardian rents and are influenced by what is called the resource-based view. So let me explain. The resource-based view, or the resource-based perspective, is premised on the idea that while industry structure definitely matters, firm capabilities matter even more. It's not just the average profitability across industries, but that within industries, some firms are more successful than others. In economic terms here, these economic profits or economic rents that we're interested in are not just due to barriers to entry, but actual barriers to imitation within an industry amongst competitors, what are sometimes referred to as Ricardian rents after economist David Ricardo. At the end of the day, the resource-based perspective is simply that some firms are more profitable than others, that they have capabilities, competitive advantage that others aren't able to replicate. Now, on the right of the slide you see here, you see a mathematical or at least a visual way to represent the idea of a firm capability. What we see here are two firms, Firm 1 and Firm 2, and it's their cost structure represented. The lower cost structure firm, Firm 1, is able to be profitable in an otherwise competitive industry because what we would call the marginal competitor in the industry, Firm 2, has a higher cost structure. In a competitive market, price is set by the marginal competitor. This is the competitor that is making just enough money to stay within the industry. If your cost structure is lower than that player, you can do very well within an industry. Now, of course, a cost advantage isn't the only type of advantage we're interested in when we think about firm capabilities. There's also something called a demand advantage, what we would refer to as willingness to pay. Willingness to pay simply says that a firm's products or services are more desirable than another competitor's and that customers are willing to pay a higher price. So in the graph, what we see is imagine two firms with identical cost structures. If consumers are willing to pay more, willing to pay a higher price for one consumer or one product versus another, because they have identical cost structure, the one with a higher willingness to pay can do very well and have a demand advantage. We'll talk about both of these in a future session when we talk about competitive positioning. It's interesting to note that Southwest would arguably have both a cost advantage and a demand advantage. A cost advantage as a low-cost carrier, lower cost structure than many other rivals, and we can see that in the data, but also a demand advantage to the extent that consumers are willing to seek them out and perhaps pay even a little more, perhaps compared to other low-cost carriers, because of the quality of service that they provide. So we go back to our question again, how do we analyze whether a firm has superior capabilities or not, whether those capabilities deliver value at the end of the day? So for the rest of the session, I'd like to use this another tool in our toolkit called capability analysis as a way to work through our thinking about capabilities and how they can provide competitive advantage and ultimately these economic profits that we are interested in. Now, when we think about capability analysis, there are lots of different forms that this comes in. All the major consulting firms will have their own way of organizing this or thinking about these issues. Various strategy textbooks might present this material in a slightly different way. At the end of the day, though, they all have similar characteristics and similar types of issues that they try to raise. And this particular worksheet here that you see is one that I find particularly useful for analyzing capabilities. So let's start at the very top of the diagram here, this notion of a value chain of capabilities.